Hi, good morning, everyone. So over the last few days, there's been this article that's been floating around social media and probably a couple of news channels as well, condemning saturated fats or predominantly coconut oil, which has apparently become a superfood. So today, I want to talk about not just coconut oil, about saturated oil and saturated fats and why that article is so misleading. As usual, it takes the media to start promoting fear into society. For the longest time, people condemned cholesterol. And today, no one's talking about that. Everyone's talking about the requirement of cholesterol for the body and how, for the longest time, we've been misled about saturated fats and cholesterol and all of that stuff. So before we start condemning saturated fat because of an article that's apparently using words like the USA or BBC and all of that stuff, it's time that we wake up as a human race and start using common sense and logic to figure out what's really good for our body before believing any media content that we see without putting a little bit of common sense into it. This article is probably fueled by some pharma company because they're realizing that coconut oil and saturated fats plays a role in actually reducing cholesterol. Because when we talk about cholesterol, we don't look at HDL and LDL ratios. We don't understand that your heart requires saturated fat in the right quantity. Anything in excess will cause damage, but saturated fat is required for almost 50% of the cell membranes in your endothelial cells that forms your arteries. It is responsible for also increasing your HDL, which is the good HDL. And when you have a good HDL, even if your LDL is on the higher side, what is the function of good HDL? They act as scavengers to remove the bad LDL that people only throw a limelight on. Oh, if your LDL is bad, your total cholesterol is bad, you have a cholesterol problem. It's not like that. So forget about that. Yeah, coconut oil and the way we're treating cholesterol the natural way today will challenge the statin industry, will challenge the cholesterol medication industry. Don't get me wrong, I am not telling people to give up their medication. What I'm telling you to give up is give up the understanding and belief that you need to be on a medication for a lifetime. Very few people who have complications need to be on a medication for a lifetime. Other than that, it is the duty of your doctor. Every doctor, including doctors of alternative medicines, we take an oath to heal our patients. Healing does not mean maintaining a patient on medication for the rest of your life, knowing that that medication is going to cause side effects and deteriorate your health at some point. So when it comes to saturated fats, before we condemn it, there's also probably the whole food lobby who's realizing that refined oils are now being challenged, that people are looking more for cold-pressed oils and natural oils that they grew up on, that their cultures grew up on. And so they feel the threat of it, and so they start talking about saturated fats. No one's talking about refined oils and how it damaged cardiovascular health for the longest time, how it damaged liver function, how it damaged brain function, how it's the number one cause of weight gain besides poor lifestyle. No one's talking about that because refined oil, they sell it in fancy bottles. They have great articles and great social content and advertisements because they have money to fuel those kind of advertisements, and we believe in it. And they drop the price to a minimum because it sells on volumes. No one's talking about the involvement of saturated fat when it comes to reversing thyroid condition, which is probably challenging the thyroid medical market right now because there are so many people around the world who are reversing thyroid function. When I say reversing, they are repairing their thyroid glands to naturally start producing TSH, which means the patient at some point no longer has the requirement to be on thyroxine drugs, which is an artificial form of thyroxine because your drug never fixes your thyroid gland. But the possibility of using a protocol of saturated fat in coconut oil and the right amount of selenium and zinc and keeping your D3 levels at an optimum level can actually repair your thyroid gland and get you off that medication, even though you've been on it for years and years. So it's challenging that market as well. Let's talk about dementia, Parkinson's, and Alzheimer's. Communities around the world are using saturated fats, which were once condemned, to actually start improving neurological functions and brain functions. Okay, and that's what saturated fat does. So before we start condemning saturated fat like we did for cholesterol, and we're all biting the bullet right now, let's understand how and why we need saturated fat in the human body, number one. I made a whole list of this because I don't want to miss a single point. Let's start off with your lungs. the air spaces between your lungs are coated with 100% saturated fat, which means if you don't have this saturated fat between these air spaces in your lungs, you have breathing difficulties. Immunity. Saturated fat is required for good and strong immunity. Your white blood cells, which has a function of recognizing and attacking pathogens, bacteria, fungi, and viruses, require saturated fat to continue with that function, which is why when people go on these oil-free diets and fat-free diets, the first thing that we see is a decrease in immunity and then hair fall. Nerve signaling. Saturated fat. You know, every one of those billion cells in the human body is covered with a thin sheet of fat. It is saturated fat that improves communication between your hormones, between your organs, between the cells and receptors in your organs and your brain. There is constant signaling, which is why when people go on fat-free diets and oil-free diets, the first thing that they face is brain fog. They can't concentrate, they can't focus, because guess what? Your brain tissue is made up of predominantly cholesterol and saturated fat. Your brain powers on saturated fat, which is why, although I don't support ketogenic diets completely, because if it's used the wrong way, it has detrimental effects, a ketogenic diet increases the use of saturated fats in, which is why people feel more energetic. People feel that their brain functions improved. And then we see that connection with Alzheimer's and dementia as well, because for the longest time, India had saturated fat in their diet, and we were a country with absolutely no Alzheimer's and dementia. And today we're one of the leading countries in the world when it comes to dementia, Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, because we changed the kind of oil we used. And we started aping all these Western methodologies, which apparently are so-called based on science, and America suffered from it. And today America is consuming coconut oil and ghee, and India is using all of the refined oil that they've dumped into our country. Let's talk about your brain. Like I mentioned, it is predominantly made up of cholesterol and saturated fat. Your liver requires saturated fat to protect itself against certain medications, alcohol abuse, and guess what? The conversion of T4 to T3, which means proper thyroid function. What's the biggest problem? One of the biggest problems we have in India right now, thyroid problems. We have the wrong fats. You require a saturated fat in your liver for the conversion of T4 to T3. You have a thyroid problem when the conversion of T4 to T3 is not happening the right way. Not when you do your medical parameters and you see and your doctor see high TSH without even making you do a T4, T3 conversion and medicating you based on TSH. It's like medicating someone based on total cholesterol without looking at VLDL, HDL, LDL, and triglycerides. Calcium. Almost all of your calcium gets incorporated in your bones in the presence of saturated fat, which brings me to D3. What is one of the biggest issues we're facing in the country right now? Low D3 levels. You need saturated fat for the absorption of D3 into your body and also as a precursor to the formation of D3. Women and men out there, we suffer from hormonal imbalances, and that's why we struggle to lose weight. That's why we have thyroid issues. That's why we have gut issues. That's why we have autoimmune issues. And you need saturated fat, which acts as a precursor. Your hormones require saturated fat and other kinds of fats to develop. So when all these girls and young women go on fat-free diets and low-fat diets, guess what? They start having hormonal issues, and that's why they lose 2-3 kilos, and then they're always constantly struggling with weight loss. Saturated fat plays a role in good cardiovascular health. Let me repeat that right now. It's every doctor's enemy. It is our enemy too when it is overdone, when it is overconsumed. But you need saturated fat to reduce something called a lipoprotein A. No one talks about lipoprotein A and the correlation between that and your risk of heart disease. You need saturated fat to also produce cholesterol, which is required. 50% or more of your cell membranes require saturated fats to form. Let's talk about breast milk. Breast milk contains 50% of saturated fats. So from the time you're born, you are fed with saturated fats, which is required for growth of your hormones, your immunity, your cell membranes, your organ function, your organ growth, your brain function, your motor and your sensory skills, everything. So are you going to stop drinking breast milk right now? Are you going to stop feeding your kids breast milk that contains 50% saturated fats because of some stupid article that talks about saturated fats? Talk about saturated fats in the right quantities. No one's talking about the connection of HDL and LDL with heart disease. No one's talking about the connection of triglycerides with heart disease. No one's talking about the connection between diabetes and heart disease. No one's talking about the connection between kidney disease and heart disease. No one's talking about refined oils and heart disease. No one's talking about inflammation, the root cause of most cardiac deaths and heart disease. No one's talking about the sugar connection and heart diseases. No one's talking about the lack of vitamins and key minerals like magnesium and heart disease. And you want to talk about saturated fats and coconut oil and ghee, which Ayurveda for the longest time has propagated, which is the best science in the world. But because it doesn't have that much of research, because no big companies are putting money behind it, is condemned. Kerala, South India grew up on coconut oil. They had the least amount of heart disease and hormonal disease. And we require the Kerala government to come up with all these records that they're sitting on. I'm talking about records that researchers and scientists and even doctors in South India are sitting on that proves the Western propaganda of refined oils. And heart disease and hormonal issues hit Kerala and South India and the rest of the country and the world when the refined oil market started pushing all your natural, unrefined, pure nut oils out of the market and bringing in their refined oils at a lower cost point and proving through the advertisements that it is good for your heart. So Kerala needs to come up with all of this information and prove to the West and everyone else believing social media and these crappy articles condemning the very oils that our country grew up on, which is part of our genetic predisposition, and it suits us. Yeah, but we have the whole olive oil market that came in and flooded India with an oil which is not even meant for cooking Indian food because of its low smoking point. So you have Indians and South Indians who predominantly found a lot of the population in the Middle East. I mean, you have most of the South Indians there and they're exposed to olive oil, and suddenly they think that bringing olive oil back to our country is going to improve health. And they're not wrong to think about it because we've been misled like that. Olive oil is the worst oil for Indians and Indian food. Unless you are adding it raw to your salads or a very light saute, you are actually creating more free radicals which create more inflammation in your arteries. And you should be worried about free radicals and heart disease more than all this other crap. Let's talk about red meat and white meat and all of that stuff. Yeah, for the longest time, America's been condemning red meat because of saturated fat. There are so many communities across the world that has lived on red meat for the longest period of time because they eat it in moderation. No one overeats red meat except Indians and a lot of the population who believe that, I get more protein out of red meat, so let's overdo it because red meat has saturated fats. You eat it in the right quantity, you have it in exactly the quantity that your body needs it. You overdo it thinking you get more protein in it. Guess what? You're also overdoing the consumption of saturated fat. There is nothing wrong with saturated fat. When countries and news channels make claims like saturated fat is the #1 cause of heart disease in our country, challenge it. How many smokers do you have in the Western populated countries? How many people do you have consuming junk food? How many people do you have overdoing it on alcohol? Add all of these factors. How many people do you have leading a sedentary lifestyle? Combine all of these and that's your #1 reason of cardiovascular health, not your saturated fat. When you eat outside food most of the time, guess what? You are accumulating the amount of saturated fat in your body. Every meal that you eat outside, have you ever seen a chef? Have you ever seen a cook go to a 5-star hotel to these so-called live stations where they do live pastas in front of you and everyone's taking selfies and clicking pictures or doing Facebook lives of some chef making a pasta live? What you're missing over there is the amount of oil that they use. They're not using a teaspoon measurement. They're using it from some plastic container like a squeezy and just, squeezing it all over some pan and then adding your pasta and everyone thinks, I'm a foodie and I love food and all that shit. But have you looked at the amount of oil that they use in your so-called pasta? Add that up over the week or each time you eat out, and that's what you should be worried about, the overconsumption of the wrong oils. But when you consume saturated fat in the right quantity, guess what? Not only will your heart health get better, not only will your thyroid function get better, your brain function, you have the ability to prevent Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, dementia, and all of that stuff. You will lose weight as well. Because for the longest time, people have condemned fat and equated less fat to losing weight. Well, guess what? Let me tell you, all your low skim milks and your fat-free milks is useless for you. You're losing your money and spending money unnecessarily on low fat, low skim, and all of that crap. Because 50% of your breast milk contains saturated fat. It has a requirement in the human body. If you don't respect the principle of dietetics and naturopathy, at least respect how your body was formed and what it needed to form most of its functions and who you are today. Look at Thailand, look at Polynesia, look at all the tropical islands that predominantly lives on coconut oil, coconut milk, saturated fats. Okay, they started getting sick when we took all of our superfoods and all of our crap to them, thinking and making them believe that, oh, you have a green juice every morning and you're going to be healthy. They wake up, they have their coconut milk in their curries and all of that stuff, and they had no cancer, they had no heart disease, they had no thyroid problems until we changed the way they eat, which was their traditional way of eating. So when it comes to saturated fat, it is the quality of saturated fat and the quantity of saturated fat. So all of you consuming coconut oil, thinking it's healthy for you, but you're consuming the refined oil, guess what? You are going to have heart disease. It's got to be unrefined, pure coconut oil. Forget about coconut oil. I'm not here to propagate only coconut oil, although I use it for every cancer patient that comes to me, every thyroid patient that comes to me, every heart disease patient that comes to me. Okay? You have ghee, which is again saturated fat, which India grew up on, which is part of our tradition, which is part of Ayurveda. So it's not just about coconut oil, it's also about your other sources of saturated fat. What about your almonds? What about your walnuts? What about your nuts? Where most doctors tell heart patients today, oh, limit your nuts because it's rich in saturated fats. I'm sorry, you don't study what saturated fats are in your 6 years or 7 years of medical experience. I have full respect for what you're doing, but don't talk nutrition when you've not learned it. The same way that people like us will not talk conventional medication when we've not learned it. Speak what you know. We have a subject called vitamin therapy. You don't even have a subject called vitamin therapy in 6 years, where we know even the depletion of vitamins in your body can create more than 100 different problems. Let's talk about saturated fat and vitamins. Saturated fat allows the vitamins from your food to be absorbed into your cells. Vitamin A, vitamin D, vitamin E, and vitamin K are fat-soluble vitamins. If you don't have the right amount of fat in your diet, it doesn't matter how much of fancy green juices you're drinking, those vitamins will not be absorbed into your cells. Then we have malnutrition and we have malnourishment. So you need fat for the absorption of vitamins into your body. Even the deficiency of one vitamin like a vitamin A can lower your immunity. Vitamin D is a precursor to immunity, to bone health, to cancers, to cardiovascular health, to your hormonal health. And if it's not being absorbed into your body, and we know that in India today, vitamin D3 is one of your biggest problems. So you need saturated fat to enable the vitamins from the food that you eat to be absorbed into your body. So the question is the right amount and the right quality of saturated fats in your plan. And you need it for better health. Now, I further went into where, when you follow research, you always come up to a source. And the source of all these articles playing around on social media comes down to a diet that was invented by a medical institute. I don't want to use names right now, but if you do your research, you're definitely going to reach the same source that I reached. Okay? It was a diet protocol which got obese people to lose weight by going on a low-fat and a low-carbohydrate diet. Now, if you are obese and you cut down fat and carbohydrate, guess what? You are going to lose weight. But then that study also showed that their cholesterol levels came down. And obviously, your cholesterol levels will come down when you're obese and you start to lose weight. But it doesn't mean that you condemn saturated fats. You have to look what brought those obese people's cholesterol levels down. It was a combination of many things. Controlling their junk food, which meant controlling their saturated fat, getting them to move more. All these people were put on a 30-minute walk every day, and lifestyle changes. So you can't just take out saturated fats and condemn it. You got to look at the other things that also were involved in bringing down cholesterol levels. So today, whether it's eating egg yolks, whether it's eating good quality sources of saturated fat, you should be doing that. Of course, under supervision of your doctors, your dietitians, or whatever it is, because everyone's body is different and the kind of medication that you're on is different as well. So I encourage everyone, I'm going to put this in the notes of my video, I encourage everyone to read this absolutely fantastic article by Mary Innig and Sally Fallon. It's called The Truth About Saturated Fats. I'm going to post the link. When you read that, it's based on common sense and logic. You'll learn to start trusting your basic instincts, trusting the roots from which you were born, and trusting the wisdom of your own culture and your own country, and stop aping the West. You are not the West. And today, as we're sitting over here aping the West, and you walk down any street in New York or across the West, there are more Americans doing yoga, consuming water out of copper jugs, eating Indian spices, 95% of the Indian foods, consuming coconut oil and ghee. They're making that change. Why would they make that change? Because they've been fooled for the longest time. They've gone through the whole medical disaster of ignoring nutrition and lifestyle and only following conventional medication. They've gone through the hard way, and they finally learned, and they're adapting, they're learning, and look at our country. Like I said, shameful and disgraceful. You have a mind of your own, you have logic of your own. I think the best exercise is that we start using it more often. Have a good day, everyone. Until next time, eat smart, move more, sleep right, and breathe deep.